for coming up on 20 years now, I have spent the majority of so I've pastored for 20 years. And then the last 20 years, I've spent most of my time working with churches, working with church planters, working with the denominations, seminaries, pretty much around church reform, church planting, a lot of church planting. And that's really been my passion. But over the last several years, I've really started taking a different approach to trying to help the church and trying to help even church planters and such too. And that's how this whole Sagebrush initiative came about. I found myself, and you'll probably hear me mention the word church planters. I've already mentioned it about 5 times. In fact, I remember the first time I met a church planter, here's what's interesting. And Brian didn't tell you, I don't know if you all know this much about Brian, but Brian's a third generation guy in a family sign company. And what's funny is the way the kids now will say, back when all of us were growing up, if someone said they blew something up, that was bad. But now if you blow something up, it's good, apparently. So he's blown that business up in a good way and really done a great job in growing that business into something that I think only his grandpa could have dreamed of. But my dad was a sign painter and just a one-man operation in a garage that's about the size of their boardroom right now. But I remember the first time I ever met a church planter, and it was out in Keller. My dad took me, we went out in his truck one day, and he said that there was a guy that was starting a new church. And that guy introduced himself as a church planter. And this would have been like in 1983. I'd never heard that term, a church planter. And I literally thought that a landscaper for churches. And I asked him, I said, so there's that much business for landscaping churches? That's all you landscape? And he laughed. He said, no, that's not what that means. And so I'll never forget that. Never knew that my life was going to be so tied up in church planting, to say the least, at that time. But it very much has been. But as I've worked with church planters, I was able to start looking back at my own journey. And my wife and I had ended up actually in her hometown just a few years after we got married. Her uncle was brought in to pastor a church in her hometown. And her uncle was from Oklahoma. So it was crazy that he ended up there. But he and I developed a relationship. I was probably 25, 26 years old. And he recruited me to come on staff. It was a little church in a little white building, probably 40 people when he came on there. It was a real struggling church, and it started developing. And we saw a lot of beautiful things start happening over the next few years. And this church really grew and grew. But in that time, I ended up developing these relationships with these older men that it's how often it is that things in our life, we don't realize how precious they have been until you look back. And I realized a bit of how precious these men were in my life, but I didn't realize it until subsequent eras in my own life. And these were just normal guys. One of the guys he was a bit abnormal because he was literally a rocket scientist. He was a professor at the college there. But he was an amazing man. We had a standing racquetball game every week. And I was 26, 27 years old when Dick and I started playing racquetball. He was 57. And he beat me bad every week that we played. And for 2.5 years, he's this overweight, 59-year-old man that just stood in the middle of the court and laughed at me as I bounced off the walls and splattered my guts and sweat everywhere. He was a mathematician. And that's what racquetball's about. It's about the angles and the attitudes. And he had a mind for it. And I thought that youth could outrun that brain of his, and it didn't. And it came down to the last week before his 60th birthday. And for 2 years, I told him, I'm going to beat you before you turn 60. And so the last Thursday before he turned 60, I beat him by 1 point. And I was like Rocky. I was in ecstasy and he was devastated. I was never so happy to see him so devastated. But for the next 2 years, I didn't beat him again. I'll tell you that much until we moved away. That was Dick. There was another guy, a guy named Gus, big burly guy that was a cabinet maker. And Gus was an amazing craftsman. And this is back in the day of cassette tapes. And he had a speaker system in his big cabinet shop, but he was a one-man show. And he would play the Bible on tape all day long. And had done this for years. And he was just full of the word, just chock full of the word of God. And he had angles on it. Like he had understanding like no one I'd ever known. And when I would have a chance and I would make excuses during the day, maybe every week and a half or 10 days or whatever, I would swing by Gus's shop and just sit, watch him work. And he would talk to me and about life and about the intersection of life and the word. And then there was another guy named George Wilson he was a prophet and he was a car salesman and one of the greatest men of God I ever knew. And we met for coffee every Tuesday morning. And those times were so precious with George. And there's another guy, a guy named Dave works for the forestry service, just a salt of the earth guy that I spent time with. And my best friend that was there, it was our worship leader. He and I moved, our families, we moved to St. Louis, which is almost 100 miles away to plant a church. And so by this time I'm 30 and we've gone through what they called church planter boot camps back then. We read all the books about how to plant a church and start a church. We were the experts at 30 and we took off and we did what you call a parachute plant, which means you go by yourself. You just show up and you hope the Lord called you there. And beautiful things happened and we were able to get this church developed. But very quickly, John, my buddy, and I, who had been in on a lot of that mentoring by these older guys, we found ourselves in the weeds, sometimes from not even from being a pastor, but just from being a man, just being a dad, just trying to be a husband, trying to figure life out. And whereas we always had a choice of one or more older guys, man, that we could hang out with and process our issues and just life with, or sometimes just feel the safety of just being in their presence. We didn't have that. And John and I would talk about it like, oh my gosh, man, I wish Gus was around. I wish Dick was around. I wish we could go see George. And then that was the first time I started realizing the power of sages in one's life. And I remember thinking, man, we should have instinctively, with the determination, made sure that our church planting team had some sage men and women on our team because our wives were feeling the same thing because they had older women in their lives also. And so that was the first time I started thinking, hey, this is essential for life. It's essential for ministry. And but no one's talking about this. And that was 30 years ago. So all the years of even running a large church planting organization, I remember all the prospectuses and all the teachings and the trainings by denominations, nothing ever mentioned about the aspect of true elders in your life and in the building up and the development of the church. And yet when you read the New Testament, you can't get away from it. And it's ironic. The word pastor is used one time in the New Testament. And look how we make everything about being a pastor today. And yet elders is used dozens of times in the New Testament. And it does not mean the bank presidents and the lawyers and the smartest business guys in your church that make all the business decisions. It can be that. But those elders back in the New Testament church were folks. They were sages. They were people that had a few rodeos under their belts, that had some wins, had some losses. There's this State Farm commercial that we've all seen many times where the guy at the end of the commercial says, we know a thing or two because we've seen a thing or two. And that's what sage men and women are, is they just walk through some life. And you mix that with the wisdom of the Lord, and you've got the way that the Lord created communities to operate, the way he's and down all over the world. We're one of the few cultures in North America that does not honor older people and doesn't treasure older people as the gift that God's given them to be in our lives. This is a quote I mentioned many times, that the average grandparents live 200 miles away from from the family, from the grandkids. And the pressure that's on young families and the lack of the acumen and the passing on of wisdom and tradition and just knowledge that kids are supposed to get from their grandparents, and the relief that young parents are supposed to get from the grandparents. In America, most people don't get that. And that's probably, I believe that's one of the reasons we're the most therapeutic culture. We're the most therapeutic nation on the face of the earth, even though we're the richest. So I've thought about this a long time. And so what I started doing a few years ago when I was working with church planters, I started saying, you have to recruit sages into your church planting team. And that doesn't mean you have to put a label on them. Yeah, I have to put a title on them, but make sure they're with you. Make sure they're an essential part of the heart of the church, and don't marginalize them and don't push them to the side. Don't just hand them a bundle of bulletins and say, here, you can stand at the door or you can be a parking lot attendant or something. No, you should be tapping into the gold that's in them. The Lord, about a little over a year ago, spoke to me one morning. I woke up and just gave me this phrase, sagebrush. And I didn't know really what it meant. It was like a song that gets in your head. I just kept hearing the word sagebrush, like every 2 minutes in my head all morning long. And that afternoon, I was just like, okay, I'm going to pray this one out. Lord, what are you saying? And it was real quick that the Lord said, this is what I want. Because at that time, I was a few months from turning 60. So I'll turn 61 next month. I'd been doing a lot of reflection in year 59. Lord, what do you want me to do with the next phase? And the Lord said, okay, here's what I want you to do. I really want you to give most of your time to this for the rest of your life, is sagebrush. And what sagebrush meant is creating situations where young men and women brush up against older men and women, where they brush up against the sages in intentional relationships. So that's what we've been working on. That's what this is all about.
Hey, so our slogan or our brand promise is where the wisdom of age meets the strength of youth. And so a couple Bible verses here. Job 12:12, wisdom is with the aged and understanding in length of days. And then Proverbs 20:29 says, the glory of young men is their strength. So on some of our supporting documents and different things that we've got together, we have a quote. Lance, tell us about this quote where it says, we see significant siloing and isolation occurring in our neighborhoods and faith communities. Where there is great need, there is also great opportunity. What do you mean by siloing and isolation?
Yeah, there's different forms of siloing, of compartmentalizing people, but we really do generationally do that really well. And I think our churches do it really well. And when I say, I'm not saying that as a compliment, our churches really do segregate the ages. You have children's departments and you have youth departments, you have young marrieds, you have college age, you have the senior groups. And sometimes we have these funny names that we put to them. But we do segregate the groups, and we never blend them. And one of the things that in Isaiah 58, when it talks about repairing the breach and repairing fallen Zion, he says that there will be the beauty of many generations, that there will be the multitude of generations will come together. And I believe that's one of the beauties of the church, that it should be. It's interesting. In fact, Brian was with me just a couple of weeks ago when we were in Missouri. I've been working for several months with consulting with a little country church in the middle of Missouri. And it is a multi-generational church. And it's one of the few churches I've found in these days where everybody stays in church together. They have Sunday school after their main church service, but they don't have a children's church. The children are in there. It's loud, it's bangy, it's rowdy. I remember the first time I was going to speak there and I'd watched a YouTube of one of their services and I could hear the kids banging around and crying and making noise. And I thought, oh my goodness, I'm so ADHD. I don't know how I'm going to be able to get through a sermon. But from the very outset, it was not an issue. It was a beautiful thing. And so you got children and you got babies and you've got teenagers and literally people that are in their 90s all together. And I thought, man, this is a throwback very much to like the little church that I spent a lot of time in with my grandparents when I was growing up in North Texas. And we don't have a lot of that anymore. We don't get a lot of that. So we silo from that perspective. We silo in our communities. We have senior communities, 55 and over communities. And I understand assisted living and things like that when it's needed, but you find very little 3-generation homes anymore. Whereas around the world, there's a lot of places, communities and villages where they would never think about the family splitting up. You think about, remember the Waltons, that was normative back in the day. And usually in a lot of ways, a young couple would get married, they just build another room onto the house. And it wasn't until Sears and Roebuck wanted to figure out a way to sell more stuff that they created the Sears kit homes. And they started out a major ad campaign to change the mentality of the American people to everyone had to believe that they had to own their own home. And there's a whole teaching on that. And I've written about that, but it's really fascinating. The whole advertisement industry went at it hard to be able to sell goods and services. You needed to have more people living on the Waltons only needed one radio. But if you could get John Boy to go out and buy a house, they're going to need 2 radios. And if you get Mary Ellen to go out and get married and buy her house. So they really did change the way that people thought and processed. And that really did start creating the siloing of the generations. And I'm not saying, hey, look, we moved from Kansas City. My wife and I were empty nesters. And we moved from a 3-story, 3,000 square foot house. We built a 1,000 square foot house here on 5 acres. We called it an empty nester house. And because my intent was to build it so small that the kids couldn't come back. I really thought I was being smart, but I made a mistake because I put a little apartment for visitors behind the carport. And of course, our son lives there now. And that's the way it works, right? But, and that's a joy. But so I'm not like making some statement about people shouldn't have their own homes or anything. I don't believe that at all. But I'm just saying this is how we got to the siloing. And so we have to be intentional about getting this sagebrushy stuff to happen. We have to be intentional about these relationships.
So Charlie and Crystal and John are the big picture is to have people who have walked with the Lord for a longer period of time in regular relationship with younger people. And those things in that relationship is what we're calling a sagebrush circle. And so we think there's going to be sagebrush circles all over the United States. This is what we believe the Lord is leading. And so we're starting, this is very much beta. And what I mean by that is
it's beta with a capital B. Yeah. We need to always say that.
Yes. So this is very much the ideation phase, inventing and discerning, going through this loop of inventing and discerning so we can discover more about what the Lord is doing. so that then we can hand it off to even more people and say, hey, these are the dynamics that work and these are the dynamics that don't work. So one of the beautiful things about this beta phase with the 3 church communities that we have participating right now is we want to have these kinds of sessions either once a month or once every other month to get all the sages together and to get feedback. What's working well in your group and what's not working well in your group. And do that in this inventing beta stage. So I just wanted you to know that up front, because you're going to ask some questions and we may scratch our head and go, I hadn't thought about that. Or you may ask a question and we may not have, or may have an answer, but instead of just stating our answer, we may ask you, what do you think? So we're really hoping to build that and to have a healthy phase in ideation as we are working through this. And here's just a couple quick dynamics, because really this is about being intentional about getting the people. There are people in our local churches who are up in age, who have walked with the Lord for a long time, and they actually don't see themselves as having anything to offer. They don't see that they can have a significant influence and impact on younger generations. We have some of those. And we want to be intentional about pulling the gold out of them. That's what these Sagebrush circles are about. And then it's also about younger people in the church. Maybe they don't know how or to approach people in the church community who have a lot of wisdom and a lot of knowledge, and they don't really know how to connect to access the wisdom. So that's what this Sagebrush Circle is all about. And here's just a few specifics. So we really want there to be at least what we're going to tell you what our working definition of a sage is. But the dynamics is that there would be a minimum of 3 sages, and then the balance. So 3 to 4 sages, and then the balance would be the younger people. And that our hope is that the group would be around 12 or smaller, 12 people total, including the older and the younger people, so that there's not too many, because we really value the opportunity for affection and connection. And if we get too many, then it's going to be more limited. So that's one dynamic. Another dynamic is we think that this routine needs to be either weekly or every other week. And Lance, talk to us about the dynamics of what does a Sagebrush Circle do when they get together?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've always tried to emphasize, pull something over here. One of the things that we've always tried to emphasize is, because in talking, we've already found out really quickly in talking with folks that are saying, hey, I'm willing to consider walking in this role, in this sage role. If some people are intimidated, they think that this means that they've got to prepare a lesson and do some kind of a big teaching. And first off, that's not what we think this role should be. A sage is not necessarily a teacher. It's more of a person that's sharing wisdom. They're sharing where life. I tell you this, I don't know if you guys, are any of y'all familiar? Do y'all remember who John Wimber was? You may have ever heard of John Wimber from the Vineyard, started the Vineyard movement. So John Wimber, I remember him giving advice to church planters. Again, there's that word. I remember him telling us that and he was really talking about reaching people for the Lord and making disciples. And he would say, you'll be successful in making disciples based on a relationship where you're continually telling his story and your story and where they came together. The Lord's story and your own story man, that was one of the best little just hooks that to keep in mind, to say, I know my story. Nobody knows my story like I do. Every one of us, we know our story. And if we know his story, and how that's affected our story and affected our story in different situations, you've got a lot to share. You got a lot of stories to share. You've got a lot of experience to share. And so that's not teaching like we would think of getting up in front of a whiteboard or handing out lessons or whatever. It's sharing the wisdom. It's a storyteller. And the second thing is that we believe it's about being a companion with people, just walking through life with folks, just walking through life. You're not directing them. You're a Sherpa. And so it's interesting. We got two guys here that met on a mountain. You know, what a Sherpa does is these Sherpas, especially on these amazing, the Himalayas and such, you've got these Sherpas that they are there because they're there with you because they've been where you want to go. And they understand the climate. They understand the territory. They can read the weather. They can know when it's time to back off, when it's time to pitch the tent and hunker down, and when you've got windows to move forward. And that's what you are. That's what sages are to me. They're Sherpas. It doesn't mean you have all the answers, but it means that you do have some answers. And if we have a cluster of sages, most likely we're going to have situations where if one sage doesn't have some help or have a word of counsel, that the other one will. And it doesn't mean that you're always going to have the answers. Sometimes your answers for questions from young people are going to be, man, I don't know. I'll try to find out, or, hey, let's go to the Lord about that one. He promises us wisdom. He said, if we ask for wisdom, he'll give it to us liberally and he won't hold it back. So that's it. And I'm not trying to recruit you here. I'm trying to encourage you that you've got more gift probably than you even know. So it's a person that is consistent, that's willing to show up at least twice a month, if not weekly. You're willing to share life experiences, not theological lessons. That's one of the things is that we see these sage circles not as a time for someone to expound on their eschatological revelations, but it's not about theology lessons. Okay. So it means probably that you're going to listen more than you're going to speak. But one of the things the proverb says is the counsel in the heart of man is like deep waters, and a man of understanding draws it out. So you're wanting to create men and women of understanding that will even draw out the insights that you'll have. To us, that's a big part of the role right there. It's more about being with than it is doing something. It's about being with young people. And I can promise you this, and I had so many young people tell me this. A lot of older people think younger people don't want to be with them, and nothing could be further from the truth. They really do want to spend some time with older people. They're hungry for the wisdom, and they're hungry for the presence of older men and women in their lives. We just haven't made it normative. We haven't made the door open and presented ourselves. So part of this is presenting yourself as open and willing to walk in these relationships.
So our hope over the next month is that you as sages would get together and begin to discover with the Lord younger people that you know that you could invite to a get together. And so you've got to talk through some dynamics about when are we getting together and where are we getting together? And then could the Lord be showing us that needs to be a part of this, and invite them. And then after about a month of that, of course, if you get that done faster, you want to start quicker, by all means, go for it. But then actually just starting to facilitating and doing it would be difficult for me to do. Let me just say it that way in what we're talking about, because it's really about the affection. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. It's really about getting together with people. And from a sage perspective, getting together and just asking questions, and also being real about maybe the challenges that you've had in life and sharing those. It's really about each sagebrush circle discovering for themselves how the Lord would want to lead y'all in your community together. Y'all might decide, hey, you know what? We're going to start every sagebrush circle with one question. We're going to drop one question or one subject. and we're just going to open it up and say, anybody thought about this? Is anybody dealing with this? And that's what we're doing with a YouTube channel a Sagebrush Circle YouTube channel that goes along with this. Tell us about that, Lance.
Yeah. So what we're trying to do with this YouTube channel that we just launched it maybe a month and a half or so ago. We've got male groups and female groups. So we've got older men conversing, older women conversing. And then we've got some in the can that we'll be releasing. We're starting to release, as far as the men anyway, we started bringing some younger men, some younger guys into the circles to get feedback from them. And we're going to start doing more and more of those. But that's exactly what we're doing, is just like what Brian said. We're just dropping a question at the beginning of these episodes, and then we're just talking about it. And we've invited these guys. We've done them up in St. Louis. We've done them in a couple of places in Fort Worth and in Dallas and Kansas City. I don't know where all we've done them, but we've gotten groups together. And the guys that we've gotten together to film these conversations, we've purposely not prepared them. So we have purposely not told them what we're going to talk about. And I've gotten emails like the night before, or text message the night before. Hey, Lance, can you give me some prep for tomorrow? And I'm like, no. Can you give me heads up on what we're going to talk about? No, I want it to come fresh out of your heart. And that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect every time. So we've had these off the cuff conversations to present topic examples of what these conversations can be. Now, what we will end up doing is, as the Sage circles start developing, we will actually start poking around and filming some real actual Sage circles after they get going. And the camera is just going to be like a fly on the wall, listening in on these conversations. And we just know that there's going to be wisdom and help come out of it. And it's also going to help set an example for what we are looking for in the Sage circles. But like Brian said, right now we're in this beta phase where we're creating a thing. Right now we're just showing the topics, a few topic ideas. We've got some lists, some white papers with a lot of other topic ideas that can be helpful for you guys. And then you can come up with your own as well. But I think we just emphasize it's not teaching, it's topics.
So, Alan, what's this? I've got the phrase in my mind. It's long on relationship.
I had a friend who had a church in Salem, Massachusetts, and in the window of his church, it was very unconventional because he was reaching out to an unconventional community. And in the window of the church, he put a sign that said, "A church that is short on rules, but long on relationships."
Yeah.
And let me just throw out a prompt, because I really love what Lance has said. And Jesus would start conversations with people by throwing out a question or a prompt. And let me just give you a possible prompt that you could use in your circles with the young people. You might say, could you just tell us what are some of the biggest problems that your friends are dealing with right now? And the reason I phrase it like that is because if you say, what are the biggest problems you're dealing with right now, they won't come clean, but they're happy to talk about their friends' problems, which really are probably their problems too.
Yeah.
So that would be my opening prompt. What are some of the biggest problems your friends are dealing with right now?
Yeah.
That's fantastic.
That's a good one. That's a good one. Hey, I'm asking for a friend. I'll tell you, along with that, makes me think, Alan. So I've got a friend, Brian heard a lot about him when he was in Kansas City with me, because so many of these guys that I introduced Brian to, they would spontaneously talk about the most important sage in their life, either than a dad or a grandpa. And it was a guy named Dan Sutherland, who had been a very important mentoring pastor in Kansas City, a huge multi-site church. But Dan was a Texan. This was probably a secret sauce. He was a Texan. But he had influenced so many young men and young pastors all over Kansas City. There's no way that you could count the legacy of what he had done. and Dan was a boots wearing, baggy jean wearing, pearl button shirt wearing Texan in the middle of Kansas City, and that hung around 20 hours in a cigar shop, leading the second largest church in Kansas City. Literally, Dan would hold court in a giant cigar shop in Kansas City, rightly named Outlaw Cigar. And for years and years, on average, and I watched this for 7 years, on average, he would lead to the Lord and baptize 30 to 40 guys out of his cigar shop every year. Just disciple these guys. And he had another element. He had a little fire pit that he pulled out on his driveway every week in the evening. And he had a group of about 5 guys that he invited to hang out. And it was an open meeting that anybody in the neighborhood could drop by on. And they would just sit there with notice that the only questions that they asked all night long was, what is Jesus telling you to do? And what are you doing about it? That was the only, and that was a pretty powerful question. And, but it would open things up. And these guys, and I remember Dan talking about, I remember him saying this many times. He said, you get 5 or 6 guys sitting around looking into a fire. He said, they'll look into a fire and they'll open up. And he said, I can't tell you how many times. He said, I've had guys look into a fire and confess their sins. Even, it's like they would look into that fire and go, guys, I'm struggling with pornography. Whereas they wouldn't necessarily look at the guy next to him and go, hey, I'm struggling with pornography. But there was something about the openness of it. Then these guys started getting free, get set free. And those fire pit groups ended up, like today, on any given week, there's going to be about 50 fire pit groups throughout Kansas City of men doing this. And just men, and they've been doing this for 15 years now. So there's all kinds of ways these circles can work, that they can meet in coffee shops, they can meet in backyards around a fire pit, they can meet in a tavern, they can meet in a gym, they can meet in a pickleball court, whatever it might be. So, of course, I'm thinking like a guy, Crystal, so forgive me. So the women, y'all have to come up with your own ideas. If y'all want to sit around a fire pit smoking cigars, man, I'm more power to you. But there's all kinds of ways that this can be done. So I just encourage the imagination on it, and as natural as you can be. So anyway, I'm rambling at this point.
No, you're great. So in our final few minutes, we have a couple documents that we're going to send to you. Julie's, you can expect those from Julie. So you'll see an email pop up from her that's got a guide for starting a Sagebrush circle. These are very short. Then there's a leader's orientation. So if you have any questions about that, and also she will send you a link to the Sagebrush a YouTube channel. And then also in our final few minutes, just wanted to open it up here. Any questions at this point?
So I have a question just about the co-ed. So you want just men and women, or are there like couples groups?
No, it's a great question. Definitely from, I know from the very outset, we talked about having 3 kinds of groups: just men, just women, and couples. So I think it can be either or. I definitely believe, I think that we would all agree that women are going to share things with women that they're not going to share if men are present. Men are going to share things with other guys that they're not going to share and open up on if women are present. But on the other hand, couples need couples, and young couples need older couples together. And this kind of goes back to that rule thing. So we're not setting rules on that, John. However, the Lord's leading you guys on that. We're definitely focusing right now on the gender specific groups, but that doesn't mean that we're adverse by any means to, if we have 3 or 4 sage couples that say, hey, I think you probably want to have more like a couple of sage couples, because then you just get too many, you overload the group. But hopefully that answers the question.
It does. We'll discuss it and see what best.
Yeah.
And do you think, maybe I should ask Charlie and Marco this, but are you looking for people in our church or outside the church or?
Yes.
I can jump in on there if you want. Sorry, Lawrence. Yes, and I think also from outside, yeah. So exactly Lawrence said, I don't think it has to be limited to people from within the church. And especially just what we have a huge push for anyway, regardless, just as Hope Rock Church, is to reach people outside.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just, and so it could be either or. At least that's my perspective.
No, absolutely. Because I believe that it's almost like that part of the ancillary fruit of this is going to be a real evangelistic aspect.
Yes.
Of this. You know, you got let's say you got a guy that works at an auto shop or something, and he's in your church and he's become part of one of these sage circles and he's really seeing benefit from it. And he's got a buddy that he thinks will benefit. Say, hey, man, you ought to come join me next Wednesday night around this fire pit with these guys that I'm hanging out with. I think it's a beautiful thing. I think we'd be crazy not to avail ourselves of that opportunity, because I think there is an evangelistic opportunity there.
Agreed.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Those are good questions.
So guys, we're doing this together and we're here to support you in this endeavor. Alan and Julia and Marco and Lance. And I really look forward to the times when we're going to be able to get together and just talk about the different dynamics and who the Lord's bringing together and how it's working. That's one thing I'm pretty excited about. It's already been really a joy for me to get to go with Lance up north and meet these other communities. And of course, Marco's been my brother for a long time, and Charlie and Crystal have known y'all for a while too. It's been really great. Lance, did you have any closing remarks that you wanted to make?
Yeah, just to say that we'll send you a few other thoughts that we weren't able to get to tonight, but you can just look at them. We want to do everything we can to support you guys. And listen, we're honored that you would give your heart and your consideration to this. It really is an honor. And I really think that we can make something beautiful together here along with the Lord. And he has there's been several prophetic words. There's been dreams. It's been amazing, actually, the accuracy of people having no idea about this and just saying things that just paint the exact same picture that others got too. So we're convinced that the Lord is in this and called us to do it, but we think there's going to be a lot of fruit in it, but there's going to be a lot of fun in it too. And that's one of the things we're going to have retreats. We're going to have some events. There's some good stuff ahead on it, but I don't think that there's many things that's more worth giving ourselves to than this. So I'm excited about it and appreciate you guys giving your hearts to it.